The stagecoach lurched to its final, dust-choked stop, the groan of the wheels a sound of weary surrender. For a moment, Clara Mae Thompson just sat there, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white as bone. The air inside the coach was stale, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, leather, and the lingering bitterness of cheap tobacco. Outside, the Montana sun beat down with a pale, unforgiving light, bleaching the color from the sky and turning the single street of Harmony Creek into a ribbon of pale dirt. She was the last one out. The drummer with the sweat-stained collar and the nervous-eyed family of 4 had already disembarked, melting into the stark wooden storefronts that lined the road. Clara took a deep breath, the dry air scratching at the back of her throat, and stepped down onto the worn footplate, her legs, stiff from days of travel, nearly buckled. She clung to the doorframe, her gaze sweeping the town. It was not much. A general store with a sagging porch, a saloon from which the tinny clang of a poorly played piano already drifted, a blacksmith shed sending up a plume of dark smoke, and a handful of other nondescript buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, empty landscape that surrounded them. No one came forward. No one called her name. The stagecoach driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-cracked lines, grunted as he heaved her small, battered trunk onto the ground. It landed with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. He did not look at her. No one did, not directly. Yet she could feel their eyes upon her, 100 tiny pinpricks on her skin. From the shaded porch of the Mercantile, men in dusty hats paused their whittling to watch her. 2 women, their faces framed by dark bonnets, whispered behind their hands as they crossed the street. From the swinging doors of the saloon, a girl no older than herself, her face painted into a bright, hard mask, stared with an expression that was half pity, half contempt. Clara's hand instinctively went to the pocket of her drab gray skirt, her fingers closing around the crumpled piece of paper tucked inside. The letter. It felt thin and brittle now, worn soft from 100 readings, 100 moments of clinging to the promises inked upon its surface. "I have a good claim," he had written. "A sturdy cabin. The winters are hard, but the land is honest. I will be waiting for you at the stage stop in Harmony Creek on the 1st of June. Your loving husband-to-be, Mr. Thomas Bailey." It was the 5th of June. The paper felt like a lie in her hand. She knew the look they were giving her. It was the look reserved for a mail-order bride, a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles to pin her hopes on a stranger. But there was something more in their gazes, a finality that made a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was the look for an unwanted one, a package left unclaimed at the post. Her trunk sat alone in the dirt. The stagecoach driver was already climbing back onto his seat, eager to be on his way. He did not offer a word of advice, no suggestion of where she might find a Mr. Bailey. He simply cracked his whip, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet air, and the coach rumbled away, leaving her in a cloud of dust and suffocating stillness. She stood there for a long time, the sun hot on her head, her worn wool dress a cage of heat. The townsfolk went back to their business, but their awareness of her remained. A heavy blanket over the town. She could not stay here, a spectacle of shame in the middle of the street. There was only one thing to do. The letter had included a crude map, a sketch of the road leading out of town, and a small cross marking the Bailey claim. It was, he had written, about 3 miles west. Lifting her chin with a resolve she did not feel, Clara walked to her trunk. It was not heavy. It contained everything she owned in the world, which was not very much, but it was awkward and unwieldy. She hoisted it, her arms straining, and began to walk. She did not ask for directions. She could feel the weight of their judgment on her back, and she would rather die of thirst in the wilderness than give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. The road out of town quickly dissolved into a pair of ruts carved into the hard-packed earth. The vast, empty prairie stretched out on all sides, A sea of brown grass and sagebrush under a sky that was too big, too blue, too empty. The mountains, distant and hazy, stood like silent, indifferent gods on the horizon. The silence was immense, broken only by the rasp of her own breathing, the scuff of her worn shoes, and the buzzing of insects in the dry heat. With every step, the trunk seemed to grow heavier. The handle dug into her palm, raw and painful. Sweat trickled down her temples and stung her eyes. She had to stop every 100 yards or so, her lungs burning, to set the trunk down and wipe her brow with the back of her hand. The hope that had sustained her through the long, rattling journey from Ohio was shriveling under the relentless sun, turning to ash in her mouth. She thought of the men who had come before, her first husband, a man whose hands were gentle only until the whiskey took hold, turning him into a monster with soured breath and a heavy fist. She had run from him in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a tapestry of bruises hidden beneath them. Then there was Mr. Abernathy, the kind-faced shopkeeper in the next town who had offered her a job and a room, his eyes full of what she had mistaken for compassion. He had taken what little money she had saved, along with the last of her trust, and disappeared, leaving her with nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and the mocking laughter of the landlady. Each man had taken something. Each promise had been a carefully crafted trap. Thomas Bailey was supposed to be different. His letters had been simple, direct, speaking of hard work and a shared future. He had not written of love, but of respect and partnership. It was all she had dared to hope for. Now, even that seemed a fool's dream. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it, a small cabin, set back from the road, just as the map had indicated. A thin tendril of smoke should have been rising from the stone chimney. A horse should have been tethered outside. There should have been some sign of life. There was nothing. She left her trunk by the roadside and walked up the overgrown path, her heart a heavy, leaden thing in her chest. The door hung slightly ajar, swinging with a low creak in the hot breeze. Weeds grew thick and tall around the foundation. A window pane was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a dark hole. She pushed the door open. The single room was empty. Not just empty of people, but stripped bare. A crude table and a single chair lay overturned in a corner. The stone fireplace was black and cold, filled with old ashes and wind-blown debris. The floorboards were covered in a film of dust and dirt. A mouse skittered across the floor and disappeared into a crack in the wall. The place was not just empty, it was abandoned. He was gone. He had never been here waiting for her at all. Clara backed out slowly, her hand covering her mouth. The crumpled letter in her pocket now felt like a cruel joke. She had been a fool, a desperate, trusting fool, and the world was always happy to punish such women. She did not know how long she stood there, staring at the hollow shell of her future. The sun began to dip toward the mountains, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, and a deep, profound loneliness settled over her, heavier than any trunk. She turned and began to walk, though she did not know where she was going. Not back to the town, not to face those knowing eyes. She just walked, putting one foot in front of the other, her mind a merciful blank. She walked until her legs were numb, until the blisters on her feet broke, until the world began to tilt and sway around her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the dusty road rising up to meet her. Elias Thorne did not like going to town. He went once a month for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, cartridges, and that was more than enough for him. He did not like the noise, the smells, or the prying eyes of the people who lived there. They looked at him and saw a man who kept to himself, a man who was perhaps a little strange, a little broken. They whispered about his limp, about the way he never smiled. They did not know the half of it, and he intended to keep it that way. His ranch, his herd of cattle, the quiet company of his horse and his dog, that was his world, and it was all the world he wanted. He was riding home, his pack horse laden with supplies. As the sun bled across the horizon, his dog, a scruffy brown mongrel named Buck, trotted faithfully ahead. It had been a long day, and he was looking forward to the simple ritual of his evening, feeding the animals, cooking his solitary meal, and sitting on his porch to watch the stars come out. It was a small, quiet life, but it was his. Buck stopped suddenly, whining low in his throat. His ears perked. Elias reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the road ahead. In the fading light, he saw a dark shape crumpled at the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a bundle of discarded rags, but as he drew closer, he saw it was a woman. He dismounted, his bad leg protesting with a familiar ache. He approached cautiously. She was lying face down in the dust, her dress torn at the hem, her bonnet askew. A battered trunk sat a few dozen yards away, a silent testament to a journey that had ended badly. He knelt beside her, his movements stiff, and gently turned her over. Her face was pale and smudged with dirt, her lips dry and cracked. She was young, younger than he had expected. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He placed a rough hand against her forehead. She was burning with fever. Elias sighed, a deep, weary sound. This was a complication he did not need. He could ride on, leave her for someone else to find. It was not his business, but the thought soured in his mind. He had seen enough people left to die on the side of a road to last him a lifetime. He could not do it. With a grunt of effort, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. She murmured something incoherent, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to his horse and carefully draped her over the saddle, then mounted behind her, holding her steady with one arm. He whistled for Buck and nudged the horse into a slow, gentle walk toward home. He tried not to ask himself questions. He knew what she likely was, a mail-order bride, come all this way for a man who had either changed his mind, met with misfortune, or never existed in the first place. He had seen it happen before. The West was full of broken promises. His ranch was a simple, sturdy affair, a small, well-kept cabin, a solid barn, and a few corrals, all nestled in a shallow valley that offered some protection from the relentless wind. He carried the woman inside and laid her gently on his own bed, the only one in the cabin. He lit a lamp, the golden light pushing back the shadows. In the soft glow, he could see her more clearly. Her hair, the color of corn silk, had come loose from its pins and fanned out across his pillow. There were faint, yellowish bruises on her arms, the kind that were old and fading, but spoke of a history he did not want to contemplate. He worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency. He fetched water from the well and, with a clean rag, gently wiped the dust from her face and neck. She moaned softly but did not wake. He spooned a little water between her lips, most of which trickled down her chin. He did what he could. He was not a doctor, but he had tended enough wounds, his own and others, to know what to do for a fever and exhaustion. As he moved about the small cabin, he was acutely aware of his own damaged body. His left leg was always stiff, a constant reminder of the mini-ball that had shattered his femur at Shiloh. When he reached for a tin cup on the high shelf, the pull across his shoulder sent a familiar, grinding pain through the old scar tissue there. He saw the woman's eyes flutter open for a brief second, her gaze unfocused, but seeming to land on his shoulder before sliding shut again. He wondered what she saw, what she thought. He pulled his sleeve down. His scars were his own business. He did not know what to do with her. He could not keep her here. A woman in his house, a man living alone. The town would have a field day with that. The preacher would be knocking on his door before the week was out. But he could not turn her out, either. Not like this. He made a simple broth on the stove, the smell of herbs and chicken filling the small room. He tried to feed her a few spoonfuls, but she could not seem to swallow. He gave up, covering her with a thick quilt. He took another blanket for himself and went out to the barn. He would sleep there. It was better that way. The barn was cool and quiet, filled with the sweet, earthy smell of hay and horses. He made a bed for himself in an empty stall, Buck curling up at his feet. But sleep did not come easily. Through the thin walls of the cabin, he could hear her. She tossed and turned, her movements restless. And then, in the deep silence of the night, he heard her cry. It was not a loud, wailing sound, but a series of small, choked sobs, the kind of weeping a person does when they think no one can hear. It was a sound of profound, bottomless grief. Elias lay on his back, staring up into the darkness of the barn. He squeezed his eyes shut. He did not want to hear it. He did not want to feel the echo of her pain inside his own chest. He had enough ghosts of his own to contend with. He turned onto his side, pulling the rough blanket over his head, and waited for the morning to come. When Clara woke, the first thing she noticed was the light. It was a soft, muted light, filtering through a clean window pane. The second thing she noticed was the bed. She was lying on a soft mattress, tucked under a heavy, warm quilt that smelled faintly of wood smoke and sunshine. For a moment, she thought she had died. This could not be real. She pushed herself up slowly, her head throbbing with a dull ache. The room was small and spare, but immaculately clean. A stone fireplace, a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, a shelf lined with a few worn books, and a cast-iron stove in the corner. Her own tattered dress was draped over a chair, and she was wearing a man's long linen nightshirt. A wave of panic seized her. She clutched the quilt to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet, steady way of moving, though she noticed he favored his right leg. His hair was dark, his face angular and serious, his eyes a startlingly clear shade of blue. He was holding a tin cup of what smelled like coffee. He stopped when he saw she was awake. A flicker of something, surprise, uncertainty, crossing his face before it settled back into a neutral mask. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. Clara could only stare, her throat too dry to speak. He seemed to understand. He walked over and placed the cup on the small table beside the bed, along with a bowl of thin broth. He did not come too close. He kept a careful distance. "You collapsed on the road. I brought you here. You've had a fever." She found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "Who are you?" "Elias Thorne. This is my ranch." Elias. The name meant nothing to her. She looked down at the nightshirt again, her fear returning. "Did you—" He understood her unspoken question immediately. His expression hardened slightly. "I undressed you only to tend to your fever. Nothing more." He said it simply, as a statement of fact, but there was an edge to his voice, a hint of offense that she would even think it. He turned away, busying himself at the stove. "You should eat. You've been out for nearly 2 days." 2 days. The lost time terrified her. She remembered the abandoned cabin, the long walk into nothingness. She remembered collapsing. He had found her, a stranger, a man, and every man she had ever known had wanted something in return for his kindness. She looked at him again, more closely this time. She saw the way his shoulder hunched slightly, the way he moved with a disciplined stiffness, as if fighting against a constant pain. A soldier. She had seen men like him before, men who had come back from the war with parts of themselves missing, both inside and out. As he worked, her mind raced. He had brought her here, tended to her. But why? What did he want? The question circled in her head, a vulture waiting to land. Kindness from a stranger was a currency she did not trust. He brought the bowl of broth over to her. "Eat," he said again, his tone leaving no room for argument. She took the bowl, her hands trembling slightly. The warm ceramic felt good against her cold skin. She took a tentative sip. It was simple, but nourishing. As she ate, he went back to the other side of the room, giving her space. His silence was unnerving. It was not a comfortable silence, but a dense, watchful one. When she finished, he took the empty bowl. He stood by the window, looking out at the vast expanse of his land. "You can stay here until you've got your strength back," he said, his back still to her. "Long enough to figure out what you mean to do." The offer hung in the air between them. It was a lifeline, but it felt like a trap. "I have no money," she said, her voice flat. He turned to face her. "I'm not asking for any—" "Why?" The word slipped out, sharper than she intended. "Why are you helping me?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. He looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "Because leaving you on the road wasn't an option." He made it sound like a simple, practical decision, devoid of any charity or pity. But Clara had been the recipient of men's charity before. It always came with a price, a debt to be paid in ways that made her skin crawl. The memory of Mr. Abernathy's greasy smile and wandering hands flashed through her mind, and she flinched. She saw Elias notice the small movement, his eyes narrowing slightly. She could not be indebted to this man. She could not bear the weight of another obligation. "I will work for my keep," she said, her voice stronger now. "I can cook, clean, do laundry. I will not be a burden." He considered her for a moment, then gave a single, curt nod. "Fine." And that was that. An agreement was struck. She would stay, but she would work. She would earn her place. It was the only way she could accept his help, the only way she could maintain the fragile walls she had built around herself. She did not trust him. She did not trust his quiet kindness or his careful distance. But for now, in this small, clean cabin, under the watchful eye of a silent, wounded man, she was safe, and for the first time in a very long time, that was something. The days settled into a quiet, fragile rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Clara learned the contours of this new life through the work of her hands. She discovered that the lye soap used for laundry would bite at the skin if you were not careful, that the 2 milking goats were stubborn and opinionated creatures, and that darning Elias's work shirts was a slow, methodical task that calmed the anxious fluttering in her chest. She rose before the sun, stoking the embers in the stove to life, the smell of coffee a welcome punctuation in the morning silence. Elias was a man made of routine and quiet labor. He moved with a purpose that seemed to flow from the land itself. He would be out at dawn, checking on his small herd of cattle, his silhouette a dark, solitary shape against the pale pink sky. He spent his days mending fences that stretched for miles across the rolling plains. His hammer blows a distant, steady heartbeat in the vast emptiness. Clara would watch him from the cabin porch as he walked back in the evenings, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. It was only then, when he thought no one was looking, that the limp in his left leg became pronounced, a dragging, painful gait that spoke of an old and deep-seated injury. The moment he saw her, he would straighten his back, his stride becoming more measured, the limp all but disappearing into a disciplined stiffness. He never spoke of it, and she never asked. They were 2 people defined by the pains they did not discuss. The most unnerving thing about him was his stillness, his careful lack of touch. It was a language she did not understand. Her first husband, John, had used his hands to possess and to punish. A grip on the arm to pull her close, a shove to push her away. Mr. Abernathy's touch had been soft and sly, a lingering hand on her waist or the small of her back that was meant to feel like an accident but was always a claim. Men, in her experience, asserted their power through physical contact. Elias did the opposite. He never brushed against her in the small confines of the cabin. If they reached for the same utensil, he would withdraw his hand as if he had touched a hot stove. When he handed her the bucket for the goat's milk, he would set it on the ground for her to pick up, rather than pass it directly to her. This constant, deliberate distance was a puzzle. It was a form of respect so profound it felt like a wall. It confused her, leaving her off balance. She was used to bracing for an impact that never came, and the waiting was a strain all its own. She insisted on doing her share, and more. She scrubbed the cabin floors until the pine boards were pale and clean. She tended a small vegetable patch she found behind the cabin, her hands, soft from years of indoor work, quickly becoming chapped and rough. The harsh wind and the splintered wood of the fence posts were cruel to her skin. Blisters formed on her palms, broke, and bled, leaving the flesh red and raw. She tried to hide them, curling her fingers into her palms when Elias was near, but he was a man who noticed things. He was gone for a full day, riding east toward the low hills. When he returned at dusk, he was leading his pack horse as usual. After he had unsaddled his animals, he came to the cabin and placed a small, paper-wrapped parcel on the table. He did not say a word, just pushed it toward her with one finger before turning to wash his face and hands in the basin by the door. Clara stared at the package. A gift was a transaction, a down payment for a future expectation. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. Inside was a pair of deer-hide gloves, the leather soft and supple, the stitching neat and strong. They were small, clearly made for a woman's hands. She looked up at him. He was drying his face, his back to her. "My hands are fine," she said, her voice tight. "No, they are not," he replied without turning around. "The work is hard. Wear the gloves." His tone was gruff, practical, as if he were instructing her on the proper way to stack firewood. But the gesture was anything but. He had seen her pain, a pain she had tried to conceal, and he had done something to ease it. Not for his benefit, but for hers. A knot of emotion, thick and unfamiliar, tightened in her throat. She slipped her hands into the gloves. They fit perfectly, the soft leather a balm against her raw skin. She did not say thank you. The words felt too small, too cheap for what she was feeling. But when she placed his dinner on the table that night, she did it with a quiet gentleness that had not been there before. The gloves seemed to break a seal on their silence. It did not happen all at once, but in slow, careful increments. The emptiness between them began to fill with words, simple, spare conversations that felt as solid and real as the wooden table they shared. "The bay mare," he said one evening, looking out the window. "She favors her right foreleg. Keep an eye on her tomorrow." "The ground is too hard," Clara replied, her voice soft. "We need rain." He just nodded, but it felt like a whole conversation had passed between them. He had a small shelf of books next to the fireplace: Shakespeare, a worn copy of the Bible, a book of poetry by a man named Whitman, and a dog-eared volume on animal husbandry. One afternoon, she saw him reading the poetry, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Is it a good book?" she asked, her hands busy kneading dough for bread. He looked up, surprised, as if he had forgotten she was there. He marked his page with a finger. "It is loud," he said, struggling for the word. "Full of big feelings." "What kind of feelings?" He thought for a moment. "The kind that make you feel the size of the sky," he said. And then, as if embarrassed by his own words, he shut the book and did not speak of it again. But a door had been opened. She learned that he had grown up in Pennsylvania, that he had a brother who had died in the war, that he came west because the empty land was the only place quiet enough for the noise in his head. She, in turn, told him small, safe things about herself, that she preferred baking to sewing, that she was afraid of snakes, that her mother had taught her the names of the wildflowers that grew back in Ohio. They were trading small, smooth stones from the wreckage of their lives, careful not to offer up any with sharp edges. About a month after her arrival, the flour sack was nearly empty and the salt was running low. A trip to town was unavoidable. Elias announced it at breakfast, his voice flat. "We will need to go to Harmony Creek." He did not ask if she wanted to go. It was a statement. He needed her to choose the cloth for a new dress. since hers was nearly worn through. The thought of facing the town again sent a chill of dread through her, but to refuse would be to admit weakness, so she simply nodded. The ride into town was silent, the rattling of the wagon the only sound between them. Harmony Creek looked just as she remembered, dusty, tired, and judgmental. As Elias tied the horses to the hitching post in front of the general store, she could feel the curtains in the windows twitching. The town was watching. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, cured meat, and calico. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man with a thin mustache and nervous eyes, greeted Elias with a forced heartiness that did not reach his eyes. His gaze kept skittering over to Clara, full of a greedy curiosity. "The usual, Elias?" he asked. "And a few other things," Elias said, handing him a list. "The lady will need some cloth, and other necessities." The word hung in the air. Necessities. For a woman. "Mr." Henderson's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Elias's tone was a clear warning. A stone wall she could almost feel at her back. While Elias was occupied with the heavier supplies, Clara moved toward the bolts of fabric. It was then that she heard the voices. Two women standing near the pickle barrel, their voices low but carrying in the quiet store. "That is her," one whispered, a stout woman in a severe black bonnet. "The one Bailey was supposed to marry." "Shameful," the other, a thinner woman, clucked her tongue. "Coming all this way, and him not even there. Must be something wrong with her. Ruined, I expect." And now she is holed up with Elias Thorne. Poor man. He is too soft for his own good. Always was. Letting a woman like that into his home, it is not decent. The words were like stones, striking her one by one. Ruined. A woman like that. Soft. The heat rose in her face, a flush of shame so intense it made her dizzy. She wanted to turn, to scream at them that they knew nothing of her, nothing of the quiet decency of the man they called soft. But she was frozen, the old, familiar paralysis of shame rooting her to the spot. She grabbed the first bolt of cloth she could reach, a plain brown cotton, and took it to the counter. She did not look at the women. She did not look at anyone. The ride back to the ranch was even more silent than the ride in. But this silence was different. It was heavy and charged, humming with the things left unsaid. Clara sat rigid on the wagon seat, the whispers from the store echoing in her ears. They had not just judged her. They had judged him, too. They had sullied his quiet kindness with their dirty assumptions. When they arrived back at the ranch, she waited until Elias had unhitched the horses and led them into the barn. Then she followed him, her step stiff with anger. He was brushing down the mare, his movements methodical and calm. "Why did you do it?" she demanded, her voice shaking. He stopped brushing and turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the barn. "Do what?" "Bring me here. Let me stay. Let them all whisper and stare and call you a fool for taking in a ruined woman." The word tasted like poison on her tongue. He set the brush down on a hay bale, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of weariness in his eyes, the deep exhaustion of a man who had been fighting battles for a very long time. "What they say in that town means less than nothing to me. Clara." "But it is not nothing," she cried, the frustration and hurt of the day finally boiling over. "They think you are taking advantage of me, or they think you are a soft-headed fool who took in a stray. They think you pity me. Is that it, Elias? Do you pity me?" She wanted him to deny it, to get angry, to shout, but he just stood there, his gaze steady. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I do not pity you." He took a step closer, and for once she did not flinch away. "I have seen what you have been through. I see it in the way you hold yourself, like you are waiting for a blow to fall. I see it in the way you look at me sometimes, like you are trying to figure out what I want from you." He stopped, standing just a few feet from her. The barn was filled with the smell of hay and horse and the coming night. "You are not Glass. Clara," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "But you have been handled like you are, by careless men, by cruel men. They have dropped you and chipped you and left you in pieces. And they have made you think that you are the one who is fragile. You are not. You are the strongest person I have ever known." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen the strength in her survival. They had only ever seen the shame of her circumstances. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and sudden. She turned away, hiding her face from him. He said nothing more. He just picked up his brush and went back to grooming the horse, leaving her to stand there with the shocking, terrifying truth of his words. That night, she could not sleep. The cabin felt too small, the air too thick, every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside sounded like an accusation. She lay on the bed, fully clothed, staring into the darkness. He was sleeping in the barn again, as he had every night since she arrived. A man and a woman, living under one roof, separated by a world of pain. The whispers from the town had unearthed a deeper fear. She was terrified of him, not because she thought he would hurt her, but because he did not. His gentleness was a foreign country, and she did not know the language. But even more than that, she was terrified of the closeness. The thought of a man sleeping in the same room, of hearing him breathe in the darkness, sent a wave of cold panic through her. She had to tell him. She could not live with this secret fear between them. She rose from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards, and opened the cabin door. He was not in the barn. He had built a small fire a few yards from the cabin, and he was sitting beside it, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, staring into the flames. She walked toward him, the dry grass pricking at her feet. He looked up as she approached, his face shadowed and unreadable in the firelight. "I cannot sleep," she said, her voice a small, broken thing. He did not speak, just waited. "In the cabin," she finally managed to say, the words catching in her throat. I am afraid of sleeping so near a man, even in a different bed. It is foolish." "It is not foolish," he said quietly. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "You take the cabin. Lock the door if you need to. I will sleep out here." It was that simple for him. He offered her the whole of his home, his safety, without a second thought, and asked for nothing in return. The tears she had held back in the barn came then, silent and hot, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned to go back inside, but stopped. She could not just leave him out here in the cold. She went back into the cabin, took the other blanket from the foot of the bed, and poured the last of the evening's coffee into a mug. She carried them out to him. She handed him the mug. His fingers brushed against hers as he took it. A brief, accidental touch that sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first time they had touched. "You will be cold," she said, holding out the blanket. He shook his head. "The fire is enough." A gust of wind swept down from the mountains, whipping a strand of her hair across her face. Before she could react, he reached out, his movements hesitant, and gently brushed the hair back from her cheek. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was as light as a moth's wing. It lingered for only a second, but it was long enough to steal her breath. He pulled his hand away quickly, as if he had been burned, and wrapped it around the warm mug. "You should go inside," he said, his voice suddenly gruff. "Get some sleep." She nodded, unable to speak, and went back into the cabin, locking the door behind her. She went to the window and watched him. He sat by the fire, a solitary, steadfast figure under a vast, star-filled sky. He did not know that she was watching, did not know that the ghost of his touch was still warm on her skin. For the first time since she had arrived in this harsh, beautiful land, she felt something other than fear or a desperate need for safety. It was a new and terrifying feeling, a fragile shoot of green pushing its way through cracked and barren ground. She was safe with him. She knew that now. But as she stood there, watching the man who had shown her a kindness she had never believed possible, she realized with a jolt of fear and wonder that she was beginning to want more. The morning broke crisp and clear, the air washed clean by a brief overnight shower. Clara rose with the first light, a new and unfamiliar resolve humming within her. For weeks, she had been a passenger in this life, a recipient of shelter and quiet kindness. Today, she would be a participant. She had watched Elias with his horses, the easy, unspoken understanding that flowed between man and beast. That was a part of this land, a part of his life, and she wanted to understand it. She wanted to feel the solid earth beneath her, not as a place where she had collapsed, but as a place she could command. She slipped out of the cabin while he was still checking the far fences. In the corral, the gentle bay mare, Daisy, watched her with liquid brown eyes. Clara had never been this close to a horse alone. It was an enormous, powerful creature, all muscle and warm breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings against a cage. But fear was an old, familiar companion, and she was tired of letting it lead. She remembered watching Elias. She took the heavy leather saddle from its rack, grunting with the effort of lifting it. It was far heavier than it looked. She tried to swing it onto the mare's back, but her aim was off, and it slid to the ground with a dull thud, spooking the horse into a nervous sidestep. Clara took a deep breath, her cheeks flushed with frustration. She tried again, and then a third time, her arms aching, her resolve beginning to fray. "You have to swing from the hip, not the shoulder," a low voice said from behind her. She whirled around, startled. Elias was leaning against the corral fence, his arms crossed over his chest. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a quiet, watchful stillness. She did not know how long he had been standing there. "I can do it myself," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "I know you can," he said calmly, "but you might be here until noon." He walked toward her, his limp barely noticeable on the soft ground. "May I?" She wanted to say no, to insist on her own clumsy independence. But there was a gentle deference in the question, a genuine request for permission that disarmed her. She stepped back and nodded, her throat tight. He did not just saddle the horse for her. He taught her. He broke the process down into small, manageable steps, his voice a low, steady murmur. He showed her how to place the blanket just so, to smooth out any wrinkles that might chafe the animal's back. He had her lift the saddle with him, showing her how to use her whole body to swing it into place. His hands guided hers as she tightened the cinch, his touch impersonal and instructive. Yet the brief contact sent a tremor through her. It was a language of gentle pressure and quiet command, a language he used with his animals. And now, with her, there was no impatience in him, no frustration at her slowness. He simply waited, letting her find her own rhythm. When the mare was ready, he held the bridle. "Up you go!" Clara looked from his face to the towering height of the horse's back. It seemed an impossible distance. She put her foot in the stirrup, her hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles were white. She tried to pull herself up, but her legs felt weak and useless. Elias moved to her side. "Here." He placed one large, calloused hand on her lower back, a firm, steadying pressure. "Now try." His touch was a shock, a solid point of warmth and strength that seemed to flow directly into her. With his help, she was able to swing her leg over, landing awkwardly but safely in the saddle. She sat there, high above the ground, her heart racing with a fragile thrill. She was doing it. He taught her for an hour, leading the mare in slow circles around the corral. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to use the pressure of her legs to guide the animal. He walked beside her, his hand never far from the bridle, his presence a silent promise of safety. for the first time. Clara felt a sense of power that was not born of defiance or survival, but of quiet accomplishment. A small, tentative smile touched her lips, and she saw an answering flicker of something warm in Elias's eyes before he looked away. The storm came in the late afternoon, rolling in from the west with a sudden, violent fury. The sky, which had been a placid blue, turned a bruised, angry purple. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that clawed at the corners of the small cabin. Elias was securing the barn doors when the first crack of thunder split the sky, a sound so loud and concussive it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. He came back inside, shaking the rain from his hat, to find Clara standing in the middle of the room, rigid as a statue. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond a simple fear of the storm. Her hands were pressed against her ears, her knuckles white. "Clara," he said, his voice sharp with concern. She did not seem to hear him. Another bolt of lightning lit the room in a stark, blue-white flash, followed instantly by another deafening roar of thunder. A sound tore from Clara's throat, a raw, animal sound of terror. Her breath hitched, coming in short, ragged gasps. She was trembling uncontrollably, her whole body shaking as if she had a fever. Elias moved toward her, his hands outstretched. "Clara, it is just a storm. You are safe in here." His words did not penetrate the wall of her panic. She backed away from him, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape from an unseen enemy. "No," she gasped, her voice thin and reedy. "No, please, no." The memories were flooding her, drowning her. John, her first husband, his face contorted with drunken rage, the argument over a burned piece of bread, the shove that sent her stumbling out the cabin door, the heavy bar dropping into place, locking her out, the storm, just like this one, breaking over the house, his voice roaring through the door. "The Lord is speaking. Clara, He is punishing you for your wickedness. You will stay out there and listen." She had spent the night huddled under the thin porch roof, soaked and freezing, the thunder a divine judgment, every flash of lightning the wrathful eye of God. "He locked me out," she whispered now, the words tumbling out, disjointed and nonsensical to Elias. "In the rain, he said God was punishing me with the thunder." Elias stopped, his hands dropping to his sides. His face, in the flickering lamplight, was a mask of cold, hard fury. He understood, not everything, but enough. The storm raged outside, and inside. Clara was coming apart. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, rocking back and forth, her choked sobs lost in the roar of the wind and rain. Elias knelt a few feet away from her. He did not touch her. He did not move closer. He just knelt there, a solid, silent presence in the midst of her chaos. He waited. He let her feel his presence, but he did not impose it upon her. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, a bedrock beneath the storm. "Look at me." Slowly, she lifted her head. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wild with fear. "You are not outside," he said, his voice impossibly gentle. "You are here, with me, and I will not let anything hurt you." His words were a lifeline. She clung to them, her sobs subsiding into ragged, shuddering breaths. But the trembling would not stop. The cold was deep inside her, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the roof. Can you hold me?" The request hung in the air between them, a fragile, terrifying thing. She had never asked that of a man before. She had only ever endured. He moved toward her then, slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her against his chest. His body was warm and solid, an anchor in the storm. His arms were strong, but they held her with a trembling, hesitant care. She could feel the tremors running through him, And she knew, with a sudden, startling clarity, that it was not from desire, but from restraint. He was holding back the entirety of his own strength, terrified of breaking something he saw as infinitely precious. She buried her face in his rough wool shirt, breathing in the scent of rain and wood smoke and him. And for the first time in her life, she felt the solid ground of safety beneath her. After the storm, something shifted between them, something deep and unspoken. The final wall of formality had been washed away in the rain. They began to eat their dinners together, not on opposite sides of the room, but at the small wooden table, the lamplight pooling around them in a small circle of warmth. The silence that had once been a barrier became a comfortable space, punctuated by the small sounds of living, the clink of a fork against a plate, a shared sigh of satisfaction after a good meal. And then, slowly, the stories came. He told her about a scruffy dog he had owned as a boy, a mutt named Jed who had been impossibly clever and fiercely loyal. She told him about a small music box her mother had given her, a box that played a tinkling, fragile melody that she could still hear in her memory if she tried hard enough. They were small, simple offerings, pieces of a past that had not yet been tainted by pain. In the quiet intimacy of the cabin, they began to piece together the people they had been before the world had broken them. Laughter, a sound Clara had almost forgotten, began to find its way into their evenings, soft and hesitant at first, but real. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a man on a tired-looking horse. He was a traveling preacher, a Reverend Pike, a man whose piety was a weapon he wielded with obvious relish. He had a long, mournful face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing and forgive less. He had heard the gossip in Harmony Creek and had taken it upon himself to investigate this den of iniquity. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his tall, gaunt frame blocking the afternoon light. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the single bed, then settling on Clara with a look of profound disapproval. "I am here on the Lord's business," he announced, his voice a deep, resonant boom that was too large for the small room. He looked at Elias. "The town speaks of a woman living in this house, a man and a woman, unmarried, under one roof. It is an affront to God and an offense to the community." Elias, who had been cleaning a rifle at the table, slowly placed the cleaning rod down. He rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. He did not say a word, but he positioned himself between the preacher and Clara. The preacher was not to be deterred. "This woman's reputation is already in question, and you, Mr. Thorne, are bringing scandal upon your own head. I must insist, for the sake of your immortal soul, that you send her away. If you do not, I will have no choice but to report this situation to the sheriff. There are laws against living in sin." Elias still did not speak. He just looked at the preacher, but the air in the cabin grew thick and cold. The quiet rage that emanated from him was more frightening than any shout. It was a silence that was cold and hard as iron, a promise of violence held in check by a will that was being tested to its absolute limit. The preacher, for all his bluster, was a man who understood power. He took a half-step back, his own certainty wavering in the face of Elias's silent fury. "Get off my land," Elias said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the air like a knife. Reverend Pike stammered for a moment, then gathered what was left of his dignity. "You will regret this," he said, his voice laced with venom. "The Lord will not be mocked." He turned and stalked away, leaving a trail of righteous indignation in his wake. When he was gone, Elias turned to Clara. His face was still hard, his jaw tight. "He is right about one thing," he said, his voice rough. "The town will not let this rest. It will only get worse. If you want to leave, I will give you the money for a stagecoach ticket, enough to get you to Helena, or farther, a place where no one knows you. You can start again." He was offering her an escape. He was offering her freedom, even if it meant he would be alone again. She looked at him. at this quiet, damaged man who had stood between her and the world, who had held her through a storm, who had taught her how to ride. She thought of leaving, of another stagecoach, another town, another life of looking over her shoulder. And then she thought of staying here, in this small cabin, with its quiet rhythms and its unexpected moments of grace. "I have started again," she said softly. She took a hesitant step toward him. "I do not want to go anywhere you are not—" The words hung in the air between them, a confession and a promise. The hardness in his face softened, replaced by an expression of stunned, profound vulnerability. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the porch. The world was awash in the soft, golden light of dusk. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before cupping her jaw, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. She stood her ground, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. His kiss was not what she expected. It was not rough or demanding. It was a soft, questioning pressure, a touch so gentle it was almost painful. It was trembling and hesitant, a kiss that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was over in a moment. She pulled back, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes wide. She was shaken to her very core, not by passion, but by the shocking, disorienting tenderness of it. No one had ever kissed her like that before, as if she were something to be revered, not conquered. Elias's hand dropped away from her face. A look of deep regret crossed his features. "I am sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I overstepped." She looked at him, at the genuine remorse in his eyes, and a fierce, protective feeling rose in her. He thought he had taken something from her, just like all the others. He could not have been more wrong. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You did not take it. I gave it." Later that night, long after the moon had risen, Clara lay in her bed, her mind racing. The cabin was silent, but she could feel his presence on the other side of the door, a steady, constant weight in the darkness. She could still feel the ghost of his lips on hers, the memory of his careful, trembling arms around her. She rose from the bed, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. She crossed the room and gently, silently, turned the knob on the main cabin door, the one he now used. He was not asleep. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, his back to her, his head in his hands. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He heard her and looked up, his expression guarded. She did not know where the words came from, only that they were the truest thing she had ever said. She stood in the doorway, a small, barefoot silhouette against the darkness of the larger room. "Elias," she whispered, "can you just hold me until morning?" He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his heart in his eyes. He did not question her. He did not misunderstand. He simply stood up and pulled back the blanket on his cot. He lay down on top of the covers, fully clothed, and opened his arms. She went to him and lay down beside him, her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her carefully, his touch chaste and protective. She could feel the thunderous, frantic beating of his heart against her ear, a rhythm that matched her own. And in the quiet darkness of the Montana night, held safely in the arms of the man who held her like she would never break, Clara finally felt like she was home. A new chapter began in the quiet cabin, written in the silent language of shared space. Clara moved her few belongings into Elias's room, a decision made without words, born from a night of shared, chaste comfort. She slept in his bed, and he made a permanent place for himself on a cot in the corner. The arrangement was a strange and delicate paradox. They were closer than ever, yet a vast, unspoken distance remained. The nights were filled with a profound and healing stillness. Sometimes, in the deep darkness before dawn, she would reach out a hand, and he would find it with his own. their fingers lacing together. It was a simple, grounding touch, a silent acknowledgement that they were not alone in the dark. There was no passion in it, only a quiet, desperate gratitude. It was enough. The days were a continuation of this gentle rhythm. They moved around each other with an unspoken awareness, a gravity that pulled them into a shared orbit. But the world outside their small valley had not forgotten them. The town of Harmony Creek, with its long memory and short supply of charity, was watching. The scandal, when it came, was born not of passion, but of clumsiness. Clara was milking the more temperamental of the two goats, a creature named Juniper who was prone to fits of indignation. On this particular morning, a horsefly buzzed too close to the goat's ear. Juniper kicked out, her hoof connecting squarely with the metal pail. Cold, frothy milk splashed everywhere, drenching the front of Clara's thin cotton dress. The shock of the cold made her gasp, and the sudden, sticky dampness was deeply unpleasant. Elias was mending a harness near the barn and heard her cry of frustration. He came over, a rare, small smile playing on his lips at the sight of her standing there, dripping and glaring at the unrepentant goat. "Juniper is in a mood today, it seems," he said. "She is a menace," Clara replied, trying to wring the milk from her skirt, but it was a hopeless task. The morning was cool, and a chill was already setting in. "You will catch your death," he said, his smile fading into concern. He looked toward the cabin. "Your other dress is still drying from the wash." He glanced at the laundry line, where his own clean work shirts were flapping in the breeze. He walked over, unpinned one, and handed it to her. It was a plain homespun shirt, worn soft with use. "Here, it is dry. Go inside and change before you freeze." It was a simple, practical gesture, the kind one might offer to a sister or a friend. Clara took it without a second thought, grateful for the warmth. She went inside, peeled off her cold, wet dress, and slipped the shirt on. It was far too big for her, the sleeves falling past her hands, the hem reaching her knees. But it was warm and dry and smelled of him, a clean scent of sun and wind. She was just about to hang her wet dress by the stove when a voice called out, "Hello, the house. Got a letter here for a Mr. Thorne." It was Silas Croft, the circuit mail rider. He was sitting on his horse a few dozen yards from the cabin. Before Elias could call back, Clara, thinking only of the letter, stepped out onto the porch. Silas's eyes widened. He saw the woman, the one the town was whispering about, standing on the porch of Elias Thorne's cabin in the middle of the morning, wearing nothing but a man's shirt that was clearly too large for her. He saw her bare feet on the wooden planks, and the way her damp hair clung to her neck. He did not see the overturned milk pail or the furious goat. He saw only what he expected to see, what the town wanted to see, shame and sin made plain as day. He fumbled with his mailbag, his face turning a dull, mottled red. I will leave it in the box by the road," he stammered, and without waiting for a reply, he spurred his horse and galloped away as if fleeing the scene of a fire. Clara stood there, confused by his abrupt departure. It was only when Elias came to stand beside her, his face a grim, hard mask, that she understood. She looked down at herself, at his shirt clinging to her form, and a wave of hot, sickening shame washed over her. In one innocent, unthinking moment, she had given the town all the proof it would ever need. Elias did not speak of it for the rest of the day, but a new tension settled over the cabin, a cold silence that was worse than any argument. The next morning, he rose earlier than usual. He cleaned his good boots and put on a clean shirt, his movements stiff and deliberate. "I am riding into town," he said, his voice flat. "Elias, no," Clara pleaded, her heart sinking. "It will only make it worse. Please, just let it be." "No," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I will not have them shame you. I will not have them look at you that way." He would not meet her eyes. He took his hat from its peg and walked out the door, his back ramrod straight. He did not go to the general store or the blacksmith. He went straight to the saloon, the dark heart of the town's gossip. He knew that was where Silas Croft's story would have taken root and blossomed into a lurid tale. The moment he pushed through the swinging doors, the low murmur of conversation died. Every eye turned to him. He ignored them, walking to the bar and ordering a whiskey he had no intention of drinking. He did not have to wait long. A big barrel-chested man with a florid face and small, mean eyes detached himself from a group in the corner. His name was Jedediah Fuller, a man who had tried to buy the claim next to Elias's and had never forgiven him for refusing to sell. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Fuller boomed, his voice thick with false bonhomie. "If it is not the saint of the valley, heard you have taken in a stray, Thorn, a pretty one, too, from what Silas was saying, though I hear she is a bit used." Elias did not turn. He just stared at his own reflection in the dusty mirror behind the bar. "That is my business." "Fuller." "Is it now?" Fuller swaggered closer, emboldened by the silent, watching audience. "Seems to me it is the town's business when a man starts keeping a soiled dove in his house. Sets a bad example. Or maybe you just like them with a bit of experience. Saves you the trouble of breaking them in yourself." A collective, nervous intake of breath went through the room. Elias turned slowly, his blue eyes as cold and flat as river stones in winter. "You will not speak of her again," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Fuller laughed. A short, ugly bark. "Or what? You will preach me a sermon?" He shoved Elias' shoulder. "I know her kind. Comes west with a sad story, looking for a soft-hearted fool to take her in, and it looks like she found one." Elias did not move. He just absorbed the shove, his body as unyielding as an oak tree. The lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Fuller more than any retort. "What is the matter, Thorn? Your little whore got you so worn out you cannot even stand up for yourself?" That was the final line. Elias moved, but not in the way anyone expected. He did not swing. He simply closed the space between them, his face inches from Fuller's. "Say her name again," he whispered, his voice a low, terrifying promise of violence. "And they will be sweeping your teeth from the floorboards for a week." Fuller, drunk and stupid, was not cowed. He was enraged by the quiet threat. He drew back his fist and swung, a clumsy, powerful blow that caught Elias on the side of the mouth. Elias's head snapped back, and he stumbled a step. But he did not fall. He simply raised a hand to his mouth, his eyes never leaving Fuller's face. The saloon was dead silent. Fuller stood there, his chest heaving, waiting for the fight to begin. But Elias just stared at him, a look of profound contempt on his face. He turned without another word, dropped a coin on the bar for the untouched whiskey, and walked out, leaving a room full of men in stunned, uneasy silence. When Clara saw him riding back, she ran from the cabin, her heart in her throat. His lip was split and already swelling, a dark bruise beginning to form along his jaw. "Elias," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "I am fine," he grunted, swinging down from the horse, his movements stiff. She would not be deterred. She led him inside and pushed him gently into a chair. She brought the basin of water and a clean cloth. Her hands trembled as she dabbed at the cut on his lip. He flinched, but did not pull away. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft splash of the cloth in the water. "You should not have done that," she finally whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "For me." "I would do it again," he said, his voice rough from the swelling. She looked at his bruised face, at the pain he had endured for her sake. To defend an honor she felt she did not even possess, and something inside her broke open. A wall she had kept sealed for years, a wall built of shame and fear. "There was another man," she said, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear. "My first husband, John, before Mr. Abernathy. He drank. One night, he was angry. He hit me. He hit me so hard my eyes swelled shut." She paused, taking a ragged breath, the memory as fresh and painful as the day it had happened. "A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, she saw me the next day. She must have said something, because the town sheriff came to the house. He asked me what happened." She looked down at her hands, twisting the damp cloth. John was standing right behind him, in the doorway. I could see him. He did not say a word, just looked at me, and I knew what he would do to me if I told the truth. So I lied. I told the sheriff that I had been clumsy, that I had walked into a door in the dark. I smiled when I said it. A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. "The sheriff. He looked at me, and I think he knew, but he just nodded and left. And John, he praised me for being a good, loyal wife. The worst part," she whispered, her voice breaking, "was not the bruise. It was the lie. It was the shame of standing there and protecting the man who hurt me, just to keep the peace. I felt so dirty, so weak." She had never told anyone. It was the deepest, most secret shame of her life. She had given it to him now, this final, broken piece of herself, fully expecting him to recoil in disgust. Elias was very still. He reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and wiped the tear from her cheek. He leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his own split lip, and pressed a soft, tender kiss to her other tear-streaked cheek. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "You never have to explain yourself to me. Ever." His words, his simple, unconditional acceptance, were a form of absolution she had never known. The dam of her grief broke, and she began to sob, not from fear or pain, but from a profound, soul-shaking relief. He did not try to quiet her. He just sat there, his hand on her cheek, until the tears were spent. That night, the air in the cabin was different. It was charged with a new, terrifying intimacy. The last of the secrets had been told. There were no more walls between them, only the vast, uncharted territory of what came next. They ate their dinner in near silence, but it was a silence full of unspoken questions. After they had cleared the plates, he sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his hands moving with their usual practiced efficiency. She sat on the edge of the bed, mending a tear in one of his shirts, her needle moving in and out of the rough fabric. The lamplight cast a warm, golden glow over the small room, making it feel like the only place in the entire world. He stopped his work, his hands stilling on the cool metal of the gun barrel. He looked at her, his blue eyes dark and serious in the lamplight. "Clara," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat. He rose from his chair and came to her, kneeling on the floor in front of her. He took the mending from her unresisting hands and set it aside. He took her hands in his large, rough palms enveloping hers completely. "I am not him," he said, his voice raw. "I am not any of them." "I know," she whispered. He raised one of her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss into the palm, a gesture of such reverence it made her gasp. He looked into her eyes, and in their depths she saw not just desire, but a profound and aching tenderness, and a fear that mirrored her own. What happened next was not a surrender, but a discovery. It unfolded slowly, hesitantly, a conversation spoken in trembling hands and whispered reassurances. Every touch was a question. He would brush his hand along her arm, then stop, his eyes searching hers, waiting for her to retreat. She would meet his gaze and give a small, almost imperceptible nod, and he would continue. He undressed her slowly, as if unwrapping a priceless gift, his gaze worshipful. When his eyes fell on the old, faded scars on her back, he did not flinch. He traced them with a single finger, his touch so light it was like a whisper against her skin. He was constantly stopping, his voice a hoarse murmur against her ear. "Is this all right? Am I hurting you?" Tell me if you want me to stop." His constant, careful concern was so foreign, so deeply unexpected, that it was almost more intimate than the physical act itself. She was not a vessel for a man's pleasure. She was a participant, a partner whose comfort was his highest priority. At one point, she found herself guiding his hand, her own fears melting away in the face of his profound respect. When he finally entered her, he did it with a slowness and care that was almost painful in its tenderness, and in the soft, flickering light of the lamp, they moved together, two broken people finding a way to be whole. Afterward, as she lay cradled in his arms, the tears came, not the wrenching sobs of the day before, but a quiet, steady stream that she could not stop. Elias stiffened, pulling back instantly, his face a mask of panic and self-loathing. "I hurt you," he rasped, his voice full of anguish. "I knew I would. I am sorry. Clara, No," she whispered, cutting him off. She reached up and touched his face, forcing him to look at her. "No, Elias, you did not hurt me." She saw the confusion in his eyes. "They are not tears of pain," she explained, her voice thick. "It is just, no one has ever been so kind." He searched her face, and, seeing the truth there, the raw, unguarded gratitude, he let out a shuddering breath and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, holding her as if he would never let her go. Their love, now confessed in body as well as spirit, deepened in the days that followed. But as the physical intimacy grew, a new and subtle distance began to emerge from Elias. He became quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, a haunted, restless silence. He would work until well after dark, returning to the cabin exhausted, his face drawn and tight. He would hold her at night, but she could feel the tension in him, a tightly coiled spring of anxiety. She worried she had done something wrong, that the reality of her broken past was too much for him, that now that he had possessed her, he had found her wanting. After 3 days of this strained silence, she could bear it no longer. She found him in the barn, staring out at the distant mountains, his shoulders slumped. "Elias," she said softly, "did I do something to displease you?" He turned, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "No, Clara, never you—" "Then what is it?" she pressed, coming to stand before him. He looked away, toward the mountains, as if the words were too heavy to speak while looking at her. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice low and strained, "my mother died of a fever. I held her hand as she passed. When the war came, my brother, Samuel, he went with me. He died in my arms at Antietam. My best friend, Daniel, came west with me after a falling tree. He was gone in an instant." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a terrible, bleak certainty. "Everyone I have ever cared for, everyone I have ever truly loved, dies. It is like I carry a curse with me." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch full of a desperate, heartbreaking sadness. "Loving you, Clara, it is the best thing that has ever happened to me, and it terrifies me, because I do not think I could survive losing you too." She saw it then. He was not pushing her away. He was trying to protect her, from himself, from a fate he believed he carried like a disease. Her own fear vanished, replaced by a wave of love so fierce and protective it was like a physical force. She took his hand, the one that was not touching her face, and held it tightly between both of her own. "Elias," she said, her voice clear and steady, "my first husband tried to beat the love out of me. Mr. Abernathy tried to steal it. You have only tried to give it a safe place to grow." She squeezed his hand. "Maybe love does not stop the pain. Maybe it does not keep the bad things from happening." She looked him straight in the eye, willing him to understand. "Maybe it just lets us carry it together." Her words, the simple, stunning truth of them, settled into the space between them and changed its shape forever. Elias's fear did not vanish, but it was no longer a solitary burden. He was a man who knew how to carry heavy things, and now he was not carrying his grief alone. In the days that followed, a new ease grew between them, a quiet confidence that was as sturdy and reliable as the ancient pines that dotted the landscape. The question of his past was settled. The question of their future remained unspoken, a shimmering possibility on the horizon. He chose a moment at the end of the day, when the sun was a fiery smear against the mountains and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. They were sitting on the porch steps, as they often did. The comfortable silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the low nicker of a horse in the corral. He was holding her hand, his thumb tracing idle patterns over her knuckles. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked out at the land, at the vast, empty expanse that was his entire world. "Marry me, Clara," he said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the evening air, but they landed with the weight of a physical blow. Clara's breath caught in her chest. Her hand, of its own accord, went still in his. It was the question she had been secretly, desperately hoping for, and simultaneously, the one she dreaded most. She loved this man. She loved him with a depth and a purity that she had not known she was capable of. But the word, marry, was a brand, a mark of ownership that had been burned into her before. To be a wife had meant to be a possession, to belong to someone, body and soul. The legal papers had been just another kind of chain, binding her to a man's whims and rages. She gently pulled her hand from his. The small movement was a rejection louder than any shout. She saw the hurt flicker in his eyes before he could mask it, saw the way his shoulders tightened. "Elias," she began, her voice a ragged whisper. "It is not that I do not care for you, more than I can say. But you will not be my wife," he finished for her, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I am afraid," she confessed, looking down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "To belong to anyone again, even you. The idea of being a husband's property. It is a cage I do not think I can bear to be in again." She was not explaining it well. She was talking about her ghosts. Not about him, but the words were clumsy, inadequate. She could feel him withdrawing, the warmth between them cooling into a familiar, lonely distance. He thought she was rejecting him, not the institution that had been used to break her. He stood up, his bad legs stiff, and walked to the edge of the porch, turning his back to her. The silence stretched, thin and painful. The future she had just begun to imagine was dissolving into the twilight. Their fragile peace was broken 2 days later by the sight of a rider approaching the ranch. It was not a neighbor, and he did not ride like a man with honest business. He was slumped in the saddle, a city hat on his head, his clothes dusty but of a finer cut than was common in these parts. As he drew closer, a jolt of ice-cold recognition shot through Clara. The easy, confident slouch, the way he held the reins in one hand as if he were above the menial task of riding. She knew him. He reined in his horse near the cabin, a slow, insolent smile spreading across his face when he saw her. "Clary May," he drawled, the old, hated diminutive from a life she had tried to bury. "I will be. It took me the better part of a year, but I found you. You always were good at running." It was Jacob, her stepbrother. Her mother had married his father when Clara was 16, a weak, gambling man who had died a year later, leaving his smarmy, indolent son behind. Jacob had always looked at her with a proprietary air, as if she were another one of his father's assets he had inherited. Elias stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowed and watchful. He took in the stranger's confident posture, the way he was looking at Clara, and he began to walk slowly toward the cabin. "What do you want, Jacob?" Clara asked, her voice tight and cold. Jacob's smile widened. He swung down from his horse. "Is that any way to greet family? I came all this way to check on my poor, lost stepsister. Heard you ran off after that business with your husband. Heard you answered one of those advertisements. Very enterprising of you." His eyes flickered around the ranch, taking in the small cabin, the sturdy barn, the herd of cattle grazing in the distance. His gaze was avaricious, calculating. "Looks like you've fallen on your feet. A nice piece of land. A strong-backed man to work it for you." Elias came to a stop a few feet away, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara. He did not speak. He just watched Jacob, his silence a palpable, dangerous thing. Jacob's gaze shifted to Elias, sizing him up. He seemed to dismiss him as a simple farmer. "I find myself in a bit of a bind. Clary May," he said, turning his attention back to her. "My investments have not panned out as I had hoped. I find myself in need of a small loan. For family, $100 should do it." "I do not have $100, Clara said flatly. Jacob chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think you do. Or your man here does. A small price to pay to keep the past in the past, wouldn't you say? The good people of that little town down the road. I imagine they are very particular about the company they keep. They might be interested to know about your first husband, about how he died, about the stories that followed you out of that town. It would be a shame for all of that to come out. A real shame. It was a threat, plain and simple. He would sell her past, her shame, to the highest bidder, or to anyone who would listen." Elias took a single step forward. "Get on your horse," he said, his voice a low growl, "and ride away. Do not come back." Jacob looked at Elias, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but his greed made him bold. "This is a family matter," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It has nothing to do with you." "You are on my land," Elias said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming as cold and hard as granite. "And you are threatening her. That makes it my business. Get out, now!" Jacob hesitated, the smile finally fading from his face. He was looking at Elias properly now, seeing the cold fury in his eyes, the disciplined strength in his posture. He was seeing not a simple farmer, but a man who had known violence and was not afraid of it. But before he could respond, Clara stepped out from behind Elias. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. She looked at Jacob, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear of him, only a vast, weary contempt. The woman who had been terrified of gossip, who had hidden from the judgment of the town, was gone. Elias's love had not been a shield. It had been a forge, burning away her fear and leaving something strong and unbending in its place. "Listen to me, Jacob," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "There is no money for you here. There is nothing for you here. You can ride into that town. You can tell them any story you like. You can shout it in the streets. I do not care. There is nothing you can say that can hurt me anymore." She took a step toward him, her eyes blazing. "Now do as he says. Get off this land." Jacob stared at her, stunned into silence by her transformation. He saw that she meant it. His weapon, her shame, was useless. It had no power over her anymore. A sneer twisted his lips. He turned without another word, climbed onto his horse with none of his earlier swagger, and rode away, not looking back. Clara stood and watched until he was a small speck in the distance, the dust settling behind him. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders slumping slightly. She had done it. She had faced her past and sent it packing. She turned to find Elias watching her, his face a mixture of awe, pride, and a deep, overwhelming love. He came to her, taking her hands in his. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "I asked you a question the other night, and I asked it badly. I understand why you said no. I was asking you to take a title that has only ever brought you pain." He took a deep breath, his blue eyes searching hers. So, I will ask again. Will you marry me, not because you need shelter, but because you want a home, not to be my wife, in the way the world means it, but to be my partner, to build a life here with me, side by side, as equals? He was not offering her a cage. He was offering her a foundation. He was offering her a choice, a home, a partnership. He was offering her everything she had never known she could have. The last of her fear dissolved, not into nothing, but into a fierce, brilliant joy. "Yes," she whispered, the word a prayer, a promise. "Yes, Elias, I will." She had only one condition. She wanted no church, no preacher, no guests. The town had judged them. They would not be invited to witness their union. Her commitment was to him, and his to her. They needed no other audience. A traveling justice of the peace was summoned, a practical, weary man who asked few questions. He stood with them on the porch of the cabin, the mountains their cathedral and the wind their only witness, and in a few simple, solemn words, he pronounced them man and wife. That night, for the first time, Clara did not wear his shirt to bed. She opened the small, battered trunk that had sat in the corner of the room since her arrival. From the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of clean linen, she pulled out a simple white shift of fine cotton, the one she had sewn herself and packed all those months ago for a new life with a man who had never existed. She had thought of burning it a dozen times, a symbol of her foolish, broken dreams. But now, it was a symbol of something else entirely, a hope redeemed. When she came out of the small partitioned corner she used for changing, Elias was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit land. He turned when he heard her, and the words he might have said died in his throat. He just stared. She stood before him, bathed in the soft yellow lamplight, the white cotton clinging to her form. She looked ethereal, a creature of moonlight and courage. He could not seem to breathe. He took a hesitant step toward her, as if she were a dream he was afraid of waking. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but just to feel the air around her, to assure himself that she was real. "Clara," he breathed, his voice full of a raw, aching reverence. This time there were no hesitant questions, no trembling hands. The first time they had made love had been about healing. This time, it was about claiming. When he came to her, she met him with an unashamed, open hunger that took his breath away. It was a raw and beautiful collision of want and need, a fire that burned away the last vestiges of their separate pains. She was not a fragile thing to be handled with care. She was a woman, strong and whole, meeting his fire with her own. He kissed the scars on her back, not with pity, but with a fierce, possessive worship. He was not just loving the woman who had survived. He was loving every battle she had fought to stand here. Now, in his arms, she was unafraid, finally, to touch and be touched, to take and to give, to let herself want with the same ferocity that she was wanted. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, the cool night air drifting through the open window. His hand was splayed possessively over her stomach, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. "Elias," she said softly into the darkness. "I am here," he murmured, his lips against her hair. "I have never," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "felt so safe and so alive at the same time." He tightened his arm around her, holding her as if she were the very anchor of his soul. He understood. For both of them, safety had always meant solitude, and feeling alive had always been tinged with the terror of loss. Together, they had found a place where the two could finally coexist. The next morning, Elias had work to do. A new calf born just a week before needed to be branded with his mark. It was a ritual of the ranch, a claim of ownership, a mark of belonging. He had the iron heating in the fire, the calf separated from its mother in a small pen. He was about to do the work alone, as he always had, when Clara came to stand beside him. She did not say a word. She just watched him as he took the hot iron from the fire, its end glowing a dull, angry red. He approached the calf, his movements sure and steady, but just as he was about to press the iron to the animal's flank, a small hand covered his. He looked up, surprised. Clara stood beside him, her expression serious and resolute. She placed her other hand over his, her grip firm and steady. Together, with her hands guiding his, they lowered the branding iron. There was a brief sizzle, a puff of smoke, and the smell of singed hair. When they pulled the iron away, the mark of the Thorn Ranch was seared into the calf's hide. It was no longer just his mark. It was theirs. They were building a family, starting a future, and their claim was burned into the very heart of the land. The snows of a long, hard winter finally retreated, surrendering the valley inch by painful inch to the determined warmth of the sun. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a raw and vigorous force, turning the frozen landscape into a torrent of mud and melting ice. The creek behind the cabin swelled its banks, its roar a constant, powerful presence. The air, for so long thin and sharp, grew thick with the smell of damp earth, new growth, and the promise of life returning. For Clara and Elias, it was a season of quiet creation. Their life together settled into a rhythm that was as natural and steady as the turning of the earth. They were a study in silent partnership. The harsh lines of solitude that had once defined them began to soften, blurring into a shared silhouette. He was the brawn and the instinct, a man who understood the land through the calluses on his hands and the ache in his bones. She was the thought and the planning, a woman who saw the future in neat columns of figures and carefully worded letters. Elias had always run his ranch by the seat of his worn trousers, his records a chaotic mess of scrawled notes on the back of old receipts. With the coming of spring, he spoke of expanding his herd, of filing a claim on the adjacent section of land that had lain fallow for years. It was a dream he had held loosely, something for a distant future. Clara made it a present possibility. In the evenings, she would spread the papers on the small wooden table, the lamplight pooling on her bent head, her brow furrowed in concentration. She deciphered the legal language, filled out the government forms in her neat, precise hand, and calculated the costs and potential profits with a clear-eyed practicality that amazed him. He would watch her, his rifle forgotten in his lap, a sense of quiet wonder filling his chest. This woman, who had arrived with nothing but a bruised heart, was now the architect of their future, building a foundation for them with ink and paper. In return, he taught her the language of the land. He took her out into the fields, the mud sucking at their boots, and showed her how to read a map not of paper, but of soil and stone. He taught her how the direction of the wind could predict the weather, how the color of the soil could tell you what would grow best, how to find water by following the line of cottonwood trees. He gave her a small section of earth near the cabin for her own garden, and together they tilled the soil, his strength turning the heavy earth, her smaller hands breaking up the clods and planting the seeds. He showed her how to plant in straight, careful rows, how to give each seed the space it needed to grow, as she pressed the small, hard seeds into the cool, dark earth. She felt a profound connection to this place, a sense of putting down roots that went deeper than any fence post. One afternoon, while sorting through her small trunk, she came across a tarnished silver locket. It had belonged to her mother. As she held it, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. It was of a girl she had seen during a brief, desperate stay in a boarding house in a town she had passed through on her way west. The house had been a thinly disguised brothel, and the girl, no more than 15, had had the same look in her eyes that Clara had once seen in her own reflection, a trapped, hopeless, haunted look. The girl's name had been Lily. That evening, Clara sat at the table long after Elias had gone to bed. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. She did not know if the letter would ever find the girl, or if the girl was even still there. But she had to write it. It was a debt she owed to the woman she used to be. "To Lily," she wrote, her hand steady. "You do not know me, but I have seen you. I have seen the weariness in your eyes. I am writing to you because I was once in a place like the one you are in now. I was surrounded by men who saw me as a thing to be used, and I had begun to believe them. I am writing to tell you that you are not what they say you are. There is a strength in you that you have not yet discovered. There is a life for you beyond those walls, a life where the sky is wide and you can breathe without fear." She wrote for over an hour, not offering easy platitudes or false promises of rescue. She spoke of the hard road of escape, of the loneliness and the fear, but she also spoke of the profound, soul-deep satisfaction of standing on your own 2 feet, on your own piece of land, and knowing that you belong to no one but yourself. She ended the letter with simple, powerful words. "Do not settle for the cage they have built for you. You are meant to be free. Run." She sealed the envelope, addressing it simply to Lily, at Mrs. Gable's boarding house, with the name of the town. It was a message in a bottle, cast out into a vast and uncaring sea. But she had sent it. She had honored the ghost of the girl she had been by offering a flicker of hope to another. Their quiet life, however, could not remain isolated forever. The town of Harmony Creek, with its long memory for scandal, had one last trial for them. The community was growing, and the question of building a proper schoolhouse and hiring a permanent teacher was to be decided at a town meeting. It was a matter of taxes and the future, and, for the first time, women who owned property or were heads of households were being allowed a vote. As a homesteader and Elias's wife, Clara had a right to a voice. When they entered the crowded meeting hall, a repurposed barn that smelled of dust and stale air, a hush fell over the room. Heads turned. The whispers started, a low, sibilant hiss that followed them as they found 2 seats near the back. Clara held her head high, her hand resting on Elias's arm, a small, public gesture of unity. The meeting began, a tedious affair of budgets and property lines. When the time came for the vote, the clerk, a sour-faced man named Mr. Abernathy, a cruel coincidence of name that did not escape Clara, began to call out the names of those eligible. When he called, "Mrs. Clara Thorne," a voice boomed from the front of the room. "I object." It was Jedediah Fuller, the man Elias had confronted in the saloon. He stood up, his face flushed with self-importance. "I object to this woman having a say in the moral instruction of our children. It is a known fact that she is of questionable character. She came to this town under false pretenses, a mail-order bride for a man who did not want her, and she has lived in sin with the man beside her. Her past is a shameful one. She is not a fit person to vote on the future of our children." The room erupted in a low murmur of assent. The gossiping women nodded in furious agreement. Reverend Pike, sitting in the front row, looked on with an expression of grim satisfaction. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She felt the eyes of the entire town upon her, stripping her bare, branding her with their judgment. She felt Elias's hand tighten on her arm, his whole body going rigid with a cold, controlled fury. She expected him to shout, to challenge Fuller to a fight. Instead, he rose slowly to his feet, his movements calm and deliberate. He did not look at Fuller. He looked out at the faces of the town, his gaze moving from one to the next, his blue eyes clear and commanding. The room fell silent, waiting. "My wife's character is not on trial here," Elias began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the barn. It was the voice of a man who was not used to speaking, but who chose his words with care. "But since Mr. Fuller has brought up the subject of a person's past, let us talk about it." He gestured to his own leg. "I have a scar here, from a piece of lead that a man I had never met fired at me in a field in Tennessee. Some of you look at me and see a cripple, a man who is less than whole." His gaze fell on a few other men in the room, men who had also come back from the war with pieces of themselves missing. "And I see other men here with scars of their own, scars they carry on the outside and scars they carry on the inside. where no one can see. We are judged for these scars, judged for being different, for being damaged by a world that was not kind to us. Then he turned his gaze to the women, to the hard-faced wives and the weary mothers. And I look at the women in this town, women who have buried children, who have survived harsh winters, who have stood by their men through drought and flood. And I know that you, too, have scars. The world is not kind to you either, and you are judged for being too loud, or too quiet, or for not being the kind of wife or mother your neighbor thinks you should be. He paused, letting his words settle. He looked directly at Fuller. My wife has scars. She has been handled cruelly by a world that has tried its best to break her, and she has survived. She has survived with more strength, more courage, and more decency than any person in this room who would dare to stand up and cast a stone at her. He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising with a quiet, powerful conviction. You can stand here and pass judgment. You can whisper about a person's past and measure their worth by the gossip you hear. Or you can ask yourself a different question. You can ask what that person builds, what they contribute. His voice dropped again, becoming personal, intimate. I will tell you what my wife has done. She has helped me build a home. She has planted a garden that will help feed us. She has shown me a kindness I had forgotten existed. Her presence in my life has healed a soul that I thought was long past mending. He looked around the room one last time, his gaze unflinching. Your judgments, your whispers, your scorn, they are nothing but air. They have never built a barn. They have never fed a child. And they have never, ever healed a soul. My wife will cast her vote. He sat down. The silence in the barn was absolute, profound. No one moved. Jedediah Fuller stood there, his face a mottled red, his mouth slightly agape. He had been so thoroughly, so quietly dismantled that he had nothing left to say. He sank back into his seat. His moment of power turned to ash. The clerk, after a long, awkward pause, cleared his throat and continued down the list of names, his voice subdued. When Clara cast her vote for the new schoolhouse, her voice was a clear, steady bell in the quiet room. She had won. It was not a victory of acceptance or friendship. It was a small, quiet, grudging justice. And it was enough. That evening, as the last light of the day bled from the sky, Elias found her sitting in the new grass of her garden plot, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was watching the sunset paint the mountains in strokes of fire and gold. He saw the glint of tears on her cheeks, and his heart tightened. He sat down beside her in the cool grass. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Coming here?" She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the fading light. "No," she whispered. "I do not regret a single moment since the day I met you." She paused, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "But I do have one regret." He waited, his heart aching for her. "I regret," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "not believing sooner that someone like you existed. I regret all the years I spent believing that love was just another kind of pain. I regret not knowing that a person could be loved this way." He did not have the words to answer the beautiful, aching sadness of her confession, so he did the only thing he could. He moved behind her, pulling her back into his lap, wrapping his arms around her. He held her as he had that first night, with a careful, reverent strength, as if she were made of spun glass. But this time was different. She did not lie stiffly in his arms, a fragile thing afraid of breaking. She leaned back against his solid chest, her body soft and pliant, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. She leaned into him like she would never break again. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below, so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.